Well, when something happens in the news and certainly in the political realm, it affects our markets and affects both now and into the future. And when that happens, we bring in Michael Greiner from Oakland University to talk about where we're at in the market and where we are going with what's in the news this week. Michael, thanks for being with us once again.
It's great to be back. I actually just voted for the Detroit Science Center to be the #1 in the USA Today poll, and I'd urge everyone to do the same.
Absolutely. mi-sci.org for all of that. That contest ending very soon. But Michael, what happened earlier on this week and is having an effect across the board in another way, even here in Michigan, is of course the president's State of the Union address that he made on Tuesday, already having quite an effect and a reaction, as always happens out of Washington, D.C. After State of the Union night. And so what are your initial thoughts on the president's State of the Union speech, but also the ways that the market has already reacted to some of the things that he said and some of those future aspirations that he detailed in this speech?
Yeah, it's interesting because this speech was very much economic oriented, which I guess makes sense because of the fact that most people indicate that that's their top concern right now, the economy. But there's something more than just politics behind this, because economists have pretty well established that psychology plays a critical role in how the economy is doing overall. Obviously, if people don't feel good about the economy, then they spend less money, and then that translates into less economic activity and less jobs. So what you really got a sense of watching this speech is that the president was kind of pump us up, really give us a sense that that things are going well. He didn't want to make it seem like he wasn't acknowledging the frustrations that some people had with the economy and with inflation, and he repeatedly touched on that he understood people's concerns, but he tried to focus on the fact that let's finish the job, things are getting better. He talked a lot about pride, and I really got a sense that he was kind of trying to pump things up, and looking at the markets afterwards and the polling data afterwards, it really seems to indicate that he was successful at it. And the truth of the matter is he's got a pretty good story to tell. There are 3 big pieces of legislation that he focused on that were passed in the first 2 years of his administration. The first is the Inflation Reduction Act, which we've talked about before. It's probably not the best name for this legislation because it's primarily a piece of environmental legislation with some healthcare issues tacked on. But nevertheless, it has some very big economic impacts because of the fact that it provides all kinds of funding for electric vehicles, providing tax incentives for people to buy them. There are requirements for the vehicles to have a certain amount of American content. And that was one theme that you saw the president come back to repeatedly, which was Buy American. So he's really trying to emphasize that. And that's a part of the Inflation Reduction Act. While at the same time, he also talked quite a bit about health issues. In fact, according to one survey I saw, he talked about health issues more than any other issue. And the health issues he talked about predominantly were the ability of Medicare and Medicaid to be able to negotiate the prices of prescription drugs and the limits that were placed on the price of certain drugs, including insulin, for example. And those are all things that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's one big piece of legislation that he pointed out. The second one, of course, is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which has over $1 trillion in funding for different projects. And he was able to point to a couple of very specific projects, including one that's the bridge between Ohio and Kentucky that's being rebuilt at a cost of $1.6 billion. Again, emphasize the fact that this is being made with American products and being made with union labor, another theme that he returned to repeatedly in this speech. So he's trying to encourage the use of union labor throughout the country. And the final piece of legislation that he really seemed to emphasize also is what's called the CHIPS Act, which is another bipartisan piece of legislation which was passed to address the fact that the United States, even though we invented the semiconductor, we've kind of fallen back in terms of being a center for manufacturing them. And so what the CHIPS Act does is provides all kinds of incentives to encourage companies to build factories here in the United States to produce chips that are used pretty much everywhere. As you pointed out, there are more than 3,000 chips used in a single car at this point. So you can see the importance of them. And when there was disruption in the production of chips as a result of the COVID pandemic, that cascaded all throughout our economy, resulting in the shortages of new vehicles and appliances and that type of thing. So he focused on those three pieces of legislation and talked about how they're kind of getting started. And I think what he wants to do then over the next couple of years is really try to emphasize that these pieces of legislation are going to be putting money into the economy that's going to benefit everybody and is going to help boost up the economy. And as you pointed out, it appears that the markets responded favorably to this message. So we'll see how his positive message plays, but so far so good on that front, I think.
Another key topic that he discussed in his State of the Union, it's certainly something that has been on the eyes of consumers and on the markets, is jobs. A significant number of jobs created under the Biden administration, and he had even made the reference that he's created more jobs in 2 years of his administration than any president has ever done in 4 years. That's been fact-checked, and it's not entirely accurate, but still, a number of jobs have been created in these last 2 years, and that's certainly also going to be having an impact on the future of our economy as those jobs are continuing to really surge and still be quite heavily available.
Yes, for sure. And we received a surprisingly positive jobs report last week with over 500,000 jobs created last month, which was way above what anybody expected. So it shows that the jobs market is still strong. And frankly, what I've been seeing lately in terms of commentary by economists has been most of them are kind of backing away from the prediction that they had that the U.S. is going to go into a recession this year, and instead are saying that probably we're going to be able to get that soft landing that we've been hoping for, and we might not even need it. It's just that as these forces that have been powering inflation slow down, hopefully we'll be able to keep growing and keep the jobs coming. But I got to tell you, I think it's probably a source of pretty big frustration for the White House right now that the president isn't getting more credit for the number of jobs that have been created. Because as you pointed out, there have been a huge number of jobs created, I believe over 12 million, as he pointed out during his administration. And the biggest, as you said, there was some fact checking on that. And the biggest complaint that a lot of the commentators had about that is the fact that, well, a lot of that resulted from the fact that we were bouncing back from a low point as a result of the COVID pandemic. And that's true. But again, it just this sense that people have out there, which all the polling seems to indicate that people are incredibly negative about the economy and that they feel that jobs are in a shortage right now. And that really just doesn't jive with the facts. So I think the president really was trying to emphasize that, again, to not just get that political boost, but also to kind of boost the enthusiasm that people have for the economy and ultimately leading to positive senses, which could lead to more spending and more economic activity then.
And we're joined by Michael Greiner on today's edition of the Megacast from Oakland University's School of Business Administration. More information on Oakland University programs can be found on oakland.edu. And Michael, certainly what's also going to have an impact presently, and I would presume in the future too, as we talk about the CHIPS Act and trying to emphasize making more of those microchips right here in the U.S. We know that the bulk of the world's microchips are produced in Taiwan, which of course has a fraught relationship with China, and with the controversy surrounding the Chinese spy balloon in the past couple of weeks, certainly in disrupting some relations between the U.S. and the Chinese, including potentially U.S. businesses and their relations to the Chinese Communist Party and their spy balloon. How might that have an impact on our economy in the near future, given that our economy and China's economy is so interconnected, and when there is a disconnect, it tends to swing both ways and affect both economies quite significantly?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that, Tyler. And it definitely has an impact. And I was just reading this morning an article where they were talking about the impact of China's reopening as a result of the COVID pandemic. As we all know, China had really gone through some very severe shutdowns to get control of their COVID spread, and they called it the COVID zero policy. And that was made even more important given the fact that they are not using the same vaccines that we have here in the United States, for example. And as it turns out, their vaccines are much, much less effective than we have. So China now has essentially put an end to that policy and is just reopening everything. There has been a surge in COVID in the country as a result of that, although that seems that the worst of it is past right now. So the economy is opening up very, very quickly. And the impact of that, of course, is going to be on the oil market, for one thing. And China's demand for oil is going up. And as we know, that old supply and demand curve, when demand goes up, then that's going to drive up prices. And so that's a big concern right now, is that with China coming back online, that it could drive gas prices higher, which is a legitimate concern. But it goes beyond that. I mean, it goes to the fact that, as you point out, our two economies right now are very, very integrated. There are some efforts at this point by a number of companies to try to reduce their dependence on China. Most notably, we've seen, for example, Apple moving very aggressively to try to move their supply chain out of China. Virtually their entire supply chain up until now has been located in China. And as a result of that, when the COVID shutdowns occurred, they were really hurt. And so they're trying to move there. And as you point out, the CHIPS Act is trying to kind of shift some of the semiconductor production back here to the United States. But interestingly enough, most of the semiconductor production in the world is not actually in China's mainland, but in Taiwan, which there it's threatened by China's territorial ambitions, much the way that Ukraine has been threatened by the Russians. So you can see where you have this global game that's playing out, and it then impacts policy. And the biggest place that you can see the impact, of course, are in the tariffs, where we still have tariffs in place, many of which were initially put in place by the Trump administration. The Biden administration has continued them and actually has introduced some additional ones, especially some restrictions on technology exports to China, out of concern that China, they kind of have a record of not respecting intellectual property the way we do here in the Western world. So in other words, what you'll see a lot of the time in China is that they will enter into these joint ventures with American companies and essentially steal the technology and the techniques that we've developed here, and then use them essentially to give the Chinese companies then a leg up in their competition against the American ones. So that's a big issue with trade with China right now, much more, frankly, of a big issue than currency manipulation, which was an issue in the past. And so the president really is trying to address that by things like the CHIPS Act, and also by creating some restrictions on what technology can be exported to China. That also speaks to the fact, too, that we're very concerned about China having a close relationship with Russia, potentially supplying Russia with some of the technology that it needs for its invasion of Ukraine, as well as also supplying China with some of the weapons technology and that type of thing that they'd be able to use to threaten Taiwan. So that is something that has really had an impact on trade. And I got to tell you, for most businesses, this is not good news. Businesses would frankly like to see a world in which we have very few trade restrictions, very few tariffs, very few policies getting in the way of directly trading with China, because, again, we have become very dependent on Chinese trade, as has China on trade with us. I believe they're one of our largest trading partners at this point. So as a result of that, there's kind of this back and forth that's going on, where on the one hand, you've got businesses saying we need to open up more with China, but yet we've got all these policy concerns that are being brought to bear by this administration, as well as the previous one, in terms of Chinese unfairness and how they compete with us, in terms of Chinese competition with us on the global stage for essentially military supremacy, and in terms of Chinese really respecting American intellectual property. So you've got these different things that are playing out right now, and it really has poisoned the relationship that the two countries had. And ironically, the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, was actually going to China on the day that the balloon was announced. And as a result of that, his trip was canceled. So it goes to show how these global issues can then kind of boil over then and impact potentially the economy, which is what we're concerned about right now.
And when it impacts our national economy, certainly has a big impact here in the state of Michigan as well. Michael, thank you as always for joining us.
Great to be here. Have a great weekend, Tyler.